quick break. Just to let you guys know, the book is out. My book is out and I'm super excited. It's called Parents Are Greatest Teachers. It's on sale on Amazon, so you can now grab your copy. Do leave me a review on Amazon, comment, DM me if you have any questions, and let's keep on sharing our stories. And now, let's go back to our episode.
Hello, everyone. This is your host, Alex Belgood, and this is Leap of Health. And today we have Mark Gober. He is going to be part of our guest for a 10-part series that we're doing, Healing to Success. So welcome, Mark. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about your story, from what makes you, from that moment that you changed your life to where you are now.
Yeah. Well, there have been many significant changes and they were very much unexpected. I have a traditional background. I went to college at Princeton University, started off studying economics and then switched to psychology. So I ended up writing my thesis on behavioral economics. Didn't really know what I wanted to do after college. When I was in college, I also was on the tennis team, Division I program. So very intense. I was spending a lot of time on that and with my academics, and was one of the captains of the team. So that was that was my upbringing in terms of how I was thinking about life. I was very focused on achievements and accomplishments. And I was always looking for the next thing that I needed to, the next challenge I was trying to overcome. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do after college, but many of my classmates were going into investment banking. And it was a competitive process to do that. And I said, okay, I'm going to try. I want to try to do that. Not that I really was so passionate about it, but it seemed like a good platform for a career to start there. So I said, okay, let me try this. And I was lucky. I got a job at one of the big New York investment banks. And this was during the financial crisis. So I started in the summer of 2008. Just right before everything got really bad. So I was there during that period at one of the banks that was having problems itself. So I was seeing things both from the perspective of being at a bank that was having difficulty, but also I advised clients that were other banks and insurance companies and asset managers, and they were having problems. So we were advising them. So I had this crash course in the financial world, and it was a pretty tough place to be. I think pretty tough is putting it mildly. I mean, I would work for months straight without a day off. That would include the weekends. And I remember when I first started, if I left before 2 a.m., left the office before 2 a.m., that was a good night. Like, okay, that's not so bad. I mean, other nights it was way past that. I was constantly sleep deprived. I went from being a Division I athlete working out all the time to not working out at all because I was working and not sleeping and so stressed out. So I was, and at the time I didn't really know, I didn't know why I was doing it other than I thought it would be a good platform for my career. Had no clue what my life meant. I thought it didn't mean anything. And I was just kind of going through the motions and looking for the next challenge. And ultimately I decided I didn't want to keep doing that. So I
bet.
Yeah, it's because many of my colleagues, the way it works is at these banks is you have a 2-year program to start, and they offer to some people a 3rd year to stay on, and then beyond that you can get promoted. So I had an offer to stay for a 3rd year, and typically people accept the offer because it's just a fallback. But I didn't want to accept it because I wanted to force myself to look for other things. So I already kind of had a hunch that I wanted to do something a little bit different and get off the track. And I sort of did with my next job, where I ended up spending 10 years advising technology companies, basically, on their intellectual property and their inventions. So I was still very much in the business world, but it was a newer company. It was smaller. So compared to what I was doing in New York, I first went to our Boston office and then moved to Silicon Valley. So it was definitely less intense, but still it was actually very intense in different ways. But I was enjoying it more and still didn't really know in terms of my life, what I was doing or what I was going towards. And in 2016, to your question, that's when things really shifted. So I left investment banking in New York in 2010 and was working at the new firm, where I spent 10 years, and I've since left, but I had this transition while I was working at the firm. In 2016, there were a combination of things that were making my life unpleasant. The most important, I think, was the fact that I didn't have a sense of meaning in life. I thought that we lived in a random and completely meaningless universe, and we could create meaning if we wanted to, but that would just be like rationalizing and just trying to comfort ourselves because life is meaningless and we want to feel good. So in the back of my mind, I didn't think anything mattered fundamentally beyond what I cared about. And I figured, well, we're all going to die anyway. Why is everyone so worked up? And it's a very nihilistic perspective, but that's what I thought science was teaching us. So that was in the back of my mind. But then also, I didn't have a full, I mean, in some ways professionally, there was passion because I was always challenged, but I didn't really know where it was going. I didn't have a great sense of purpose. And we had some business deals that I spent lots of time on that didn't go our way. And that's really tough for someone who's so focused on work. And then additionally, in my personal life, some things like dating, things that weren't going the way that I wanted, combined with this sense of meaninglessness, I was not in a good place. I was totally lost and just like, what am I doing? So I was listening to podcasts starting in 2016. And I actually remember a friend forwarded me, I think it was Tim Ferriss. He was interviewing a venture capitalist, and podcasts were somewhat new at the time. And I remember listening to it and saying, this is so cool. You can listen to someone's experience. And like, then I started listening to more podcasts, and I ventured more into the health space as well. And in addition to business, and I stumbled upon a health show called Extreme Health Radio. And in August of 2016, one of the episodes I heard was a woman named Laura Powers, who was talking about her psychic abilities and her ability to talk to spirits and things that sounded very paranormal. This was a health show. I wasn't listening because I was looking for that kind of thing. It just it happened to be the next show that I just went to the next one. And I just remember being really interested in what she had to say. It wasn't like my worldview shifted overnight, but these were things that were not part of my worldview that she was talking about. And she was very nonchalant, like, oh yeah, this is what I do. I advise clients. Like, it was totally normal. At the end of that episode, she said she has her own podcast called Healing Powers. And I said, okay, that's cool, because I have this long drive living in San Francisco. Our office is down in Silicon Valley, tons of traffic. I'll turn on this podcast. And long story short, I ended up listening to all of her episodes from 2016 back to 2011 within the course of a few weeks. I just listened to all of them. And I realized something was up, because she wasn't the only one talking about this stuff. There were other people coming from different backgrounds, and they were all converging on a very similar kind of a worldview that many of us might call spiritual. I know that term can have sometimes, for those who are not familiar with it, like I used to be, that can have a negative connotation, sort of like wishful thinking. But I mean it in the sense of the nature of reality, if we look at it scientifically, points toward a spiritual direction. And that's what started to happen for me, is that I looked at science after listening to Laura's podcast and investigated more of the principles that were discussed there, and found lots of peer-reviewed scientific papers, and the US government was involved in this. And even my alma mater, Princeton, had a lab where they were studying these types of phenomena. And I was really blown away, because I realized that there was a whole, that the way I used to look at the world was such a limited sliver of a bigger reality that I had no conception of before. So I was in this very strange place of, I used to feel like my life had no meaning and was just totally lost, didn't know what I was doing, like a zombie, just going through the motions at that point, to, oh my goodness, that my worldview needs to shift completely. So I was really disoriented. It's funny for me to think back now, because 5.5 years-ish removed from that period, I was in such a different place mentally. I didn't know what to think. I didn't really know who to talk to about this stuff, because in my circles, this was like so out there. I had no one talked about these things. So what I did was I started to tell friends about what I was learning. Started with some really close friends. And then as I learned more about the science that seemed really credible to me, I would talk to friends like over dinner or brunch and just tell them what I was learning about. And some of them just thought I was having fun, but they weren't like, it didn't shift them at all. But other people were super interested. And they were like, okay, Mark, I need to think about this more. And then I started working with psychics and doing the things that I was reading about. And the psychics that I worked with were sometimes able to do things that I couldn't explain. So I was having some personal anecdotes, and I was having lots of synchronicities where there would be strange coincidences where when I tried to do the math in my head, they were so improbable, and they were happening all the time, where like a certain term or word would be popping up everywhere, and like it was totally random, seemingly random word. Like there were so many of these things happening, and I was making notes of them as they were happening. So my worldview was shifting, and I was starting to talk to people about it. And at this point, there was no plan of speaking about these things publicly, of writing books or doing a podcast, which ultimately came later. That wasn't the plan here. This was there was a passion that came about because I realized that I had to rethink everything. And I felt like such a novice, and I still do, that I felt like there was so much more I needed to learn, because if life is meaningful in some way, which I now think it is, and I think there's a lot of evidence to point in that direction, then how should I be living? What should I be prioritizing, et cetera? So there was this endless process of discovery. And then finally, it came to, I was in June of 2017. So almost a year after I first had this initial spark from Laura's podcast on Extreme Health Radio, I had an inclination that maybe I should write a book. I vaguely remember exactly how it happened, but I was leaving my apartment to go to work one morning, and the idea popped in. That's my memory of it, of like, oh, maybe you should just put this stuff down on paper and write a book and talk about all these things like telepathy and communicating with the deceased and all that stuff. And then I thought to myself, Mark, you're in the business world. I became a partner at my firm later, but I wasn't a partner yet. I was still like developing my career in many ways, and talking about psychic abilities and surviving after our body dies. That just seemed like it would be a big departure from my career, and would there be risk? So I had these things going through my mind, but then I thought to myself, well, like, this is so important, I should do it anyway. And then I thought to myself, writing a book on this is going to take so much time. Like, I had the outline in my head of what it would be, but this is a major process. I don't know if I'm going to do it. And I was kind of going back and forth in my mind. And I remember having dinner with two friends in June of 2017. And I was talking about this, and they were like, you should just try it. You should just do it. So I took the July 4th weekend that year, which was a long weekend for the holiday. And I had friends, they were all like partying and doing other things. I was getting invited to do stuff. And I was like, no, I'm going to stay in my apartment. I'm going to try to write this book, because I was really busy on a work project and other things. So I'm going to take this period where I'm free and write as much as I can. I'm going to like go back to being an investment banker and not sleep. And I ended up writing probably more than half of the book in that long weekend. Wow. And then, now we're here. I ended up writing that book, which was published in 2018, called An End Upside Down Thinking. I then did a podcast the next year called Where Is My Mind, where I interviewed scientists. I also interviewed Laura, people that have had those experiences. And then at the end of 2019, I got the pull where I wanted to spend so much time in this area of researching and learning and personal development and healing and all this stuff. And my job was taking energy away from that. And I was in a great position. Like, if I had looked at the position I was in 10 years ago, I'd say, wow, Mark, you're totally set. This is a great job, really interesting stuff, great clients, great coworkers. But it did not feel the same. It did not resonate in the same way energetically. That's the best way I can put it, where it was almost a stressful thing to pull myself away from my passions and spend all this time with my job. And it did take a lot of effort and thinking and time and energy to be in that job. So it was almost felt like not only was it unpleasant for me if I wasn't fully passionate, but it was also unfair, I felt, to the people around me, my clients, my colleagues. So I had a big internal struggle, but ultimately decided that I should do something else without knowing what that would be. So I left my job. I took the leap, and most people that leave jobs are going to a competitor or something or something similar. I didn't know what I was going to do. Then I decided to write a second book in early 2020, and then wrote a third book in 2021. And here we are today.
Wow. That's That's such an amazing story to go from, because I bet you when you were working with the bank, you really never had a thought of like, oh, I'm gonna write a book one day about something else not related to like money and banking and any of that. Do you think becoming or understanding spirituality gave you that change of mind within your life?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Because my view now, just to summarize how I look at life and my own self and all of us, is that our identity is not our body. Our identity is this abstract consciousness, our sense of awareness. Some might call it a soul, and it inhabits the body. And when we die, the consciousness continues on and could be recycled into a new body, et cetera. And that we're here to try to evolve at the level of our consciousness. We're trying to learn and understand that we're all interconnected and acting from that place. So with that kind of a worldview, just to give a very high level, the things that I prioritized were shifting so dramatically that the things I used to care about didn't matter as much. So I what matters now is, to me, is really personal development and my own personal evolution, so that I can be of service in some way. So that's really why I wrote the book and have been writing books. But initially, the first inclination was, this is a really important topic. It changed my life completely. Why don't I put this into a book and make it easy for people so they don't have to like look at 100 different books and all these different podcasts? I'm going to summarize it for them so they're going to have it in one place. That was my thinking. It was more of a service oriented thing. And that orientation ultimately led me to leave the profession that I spent so much time on, because I look at life differently. So the things that I'm really focused on are finding ways to develop myself and to provide service. And so far, that has manifested for me as I learn a lot of stuff doing research, and then I summarize it and let people know about what that is. I don't know how it's going to be in the future, but that has been the primary way, other than just in my personal life, trying to be a good person, which I was trying to be even before all this happened. That part hasn't shifted, but I see a different meaning behind it.
Yeah, for sure. And something that we think about when you become a little bit more on the spiritual level, we know we're all going to die. That's like a fact. And you mentioned that earlier. And so now that you feel that life, it's infinite, because I feel like, and obviously everybody has like different beliefs when it comes to like religion and spirituality and all that. But you seem to, from what I know from you, you see life infinite, and that gives you so much power within yourself, right? As opposed to like everybody thinks you're born, you get married, you have kids, you have a job, and you do that same job for whatever years, and then you die.
Yes, exactly. That's how I used to think about it.
Right. Is that why you thought like there was like really no meaning in life?
Yeah, I had that exact worldview. That, well, like I couldn't, but it was strange because I still was very motivated, and I couldn't understand why. We could probably theorize why, but even back then I knew, to me, life was meaningless. I'm going to work hard and then ultimately die like everyone else, and that's going to be the end of it. Yeah. But I felt like there was still an obligation to try to do things. And that's where a lot of the tension came in. I really came to a head around 2016. I would say it started maybe in 2014, 15. There was a period of just like this. There was a pattern of, I would have a challenge that I would try to accomplish. And sometimes I would accomplish it, other times I wouldn't. And it was like a treadmill. Because no matter what happened, let's say I achieved the thing that I really wanted, never thought I could achieve, and that happened sometimes. And then 5 minutes later, it would be like nothing happened. I was back to baseline and I was worried about the next thing. So that can only last for so long, especially if you don't think there's any real meaning behind it. And then it's very difficult to function in that way.
Yeah. I know I spoke to a couple of interviews ago, I spoke to a doctor. He's a psychologist, and he also study like human behavior and all that. And he talks about how like important it is to actually have some sort of a meaning in life. Otherwise, it kind of like happens what you just said. We have a challenge and we go through it, but it's kind of like just like a circle with no like ending, with no like with that amazing rewards that you can feel when you believe in something.
Exactly. Having the deeper sense of purpose that was lacking. So now it's not like life is perfect all of a sudden. There's still many challenges, and I still feel like I'm growing and evolving, but there's something behind all of that that I didn't have before that makes even the more challenging times less challenging, or it's more short-lived because my perspective is so different.
Right. And how do you think, what was the healing path or how does this change you from the Mark that was in school and like driven to do, school and just life in general, as opposed to like now? What do you think the healing process make you evolve to now?
Well, the healing process is something that I'm now conscious of. Before, I wasn't even conscious of that process. I was just so focused on whatever goal was ahead of me, personally, professionally, whatever. That's what I was focused on. And healing, that would be like a secondary consideration. That wouldn't have been important unless it was an obstacle to something that I was trying to achieve. Now I see it as a fundamental part of existence, because it's part of our evolution to heal ourselves. Because when we do that, we can become what I would say is like a more pure version of a vessel. Whatever it is, this consciousness that's working through us and the intelligence that works through our bodies, that is most effective when we are in a pure state. So that means healing ourselves.
Yeah, that's awesome. And throughout all this journey, I know we always encounter people that mentor us. How important was that in your journey?
Great question. Very important. Critical. Because like I said, I didn't know anyone when I first started this, that I didn't know people were interested in these subjects. Now I know there's a huge segment of the population, but I was completely in the dark. So I felt extremely alone, especially in my circles. But when I worked with psychics and channelers and mediums, people that were doing this sort of thing, or different healers, I tried all of it. If I heard about it on a podcast, I would contact someone and then I would get recommendations. And those people became mentors. So I used to call it an army of counselors, because these people knew the world that I was entering and I had zero concept of what it was. And that was critical. And there are still people that I would consider to be mentors. And something I wrote about in my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, which is on this process of basically living with a spiritual mentality. When I studied many of the cases of people that go through these awakenings, and that's what I would call my journey, I had a dark night of the soul. That's the term that people use, where you have some kind of a trauma. And for some people, it could be an illness or a death in the family, things like. For me, it was my story, but it was still definitely a dark night of the soul. When people go through this journey, one of the common threads is that the journey is made easier when there is a mentor. And in some ways it's essential, because without having a third party to show a mirror to what you're doing, sometimes you need that feedback mechanism. And there was one spiritual teacher I mentioned in my book, who she's arguably very elevated, highly enlightened, if you want to use that term. And she forces herself to go on retreats with 3 different spiritual teachers every year, because she wants to hear their perspective and help her own learning. And without having that mentor perspective, we can get stuck in our own mind and not see the flaws, and that can be dangerous.
That's super important, I think, too. I feel like sometimes we feel, and I mean, not to take any credit from anyone. Some people might said, I got to where I am because because I did it, or whatever. But I think it is important just for about anyone to get mentorship, because it does shows you where you are. It puts you back in the mental state of always a student, which is almost like always being an open-minded person in regards of anything that, whether you're a teacher, a dancer, an artist. If the moment you stop having any mentorship, is almost like that moment where you close your everything to new stuff.
Yeah, it's so critical, that point you just made. And some spiritual teachers will use the term humility to describe exactly what you said. This constant reminder of how little we actually know, no matter how enlightened we are. And I mean, for me to think that all of these things have happened, especially over the last 5.5 years, because like I'm so talented that I'm able to write a book and etc. It's not, there's no way that that this body alone could have done those things. That I feel more like the vehicle and the vessel that is constantly trying to take in knowledge and transmit it, but it's not like I'm the one generating that knowledge. And in tandem with that, the more I've learned in my studies, whatever I'm researching, it's like there's a new rabbit hole associated with each thing. So the more that I've learned, the more that I realize I actually don't know. And but I can understand, and I've seen this happen in let's say like pitfalls in the spiritual process, where you can get to a point where it's like, oh, I'm really advanced and I know X, Y, and Z, and this is all there is to know. That can be a dangerous trap that a lot of people talk about, where then you lose the openness. You start to form a rigidity, which is counter to the whole process.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's just not within, spiritually speaking, but just like about in everything. I am a professional dancer, and at some point I was like, I need to take classes. I teach all day long. I teach every day. But you get to that point where you clearly see there's always going to be someone better. There's always going to be something new coming up. And I think it is a deserve to our own selves to stop ourselves from learning and exploring and be curious about what life has to offer, just in general, in any career.
This is actually one of the topics, again, in my second book, An End Upside Down Living, the notion of enlightenment. And sometimes it can be perceived as a final state that's one thing and there's no evolution past it. And what many of the spiritual teachers that I really like have to say about it is that it's not an end point. It's a spectrum, and there's never an end to the evolution. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because it's like, no matter how advanced someone might be, there's probably infinite growth that can occur. And another important factor there is then it makes less sense to look down upon other people, because everyone's evolving no matter where we are on this spectrum. So it's sort of like, well, that person's going through those challenges and I'm going through different challenges, and this other person's going through different challenges. It's looked at more objectively rather than a form of judgment.
Yeah, for sure. I have a kind of like a mantra, or I think that I repeat to myself often, just to kind of keep me in check. That there's no one below me and there's no one above me. We're all the same, and as you said, we're all going through like different processes at different times, and that doesn't mean we're in any way better than any other person.
Exactly.
And I know we've been talking about healing to success. How do you see success now?
Great question. Overall, the ultimate success is, as I see it, my own evolution spiritually and my own healing and growth. And depending on the tradition, there are different pathways to that. The yogic tradition, I like to simplify the 4 pathways, because to me, this is how success manifests through these pathways. And one is the pathway of knowledge and wisdom. And that's where I spend a lot of time focusing, is learning, understanding the nature of reality at an intellectual level. Then there's the pathway of selfless service, a pathway of devotion. And that can be like just having an attitude of being very gracious, having gratitude, things like chanting, love for the divine is what many would say. That kind of an attitude, that's the devotional path. And then another category, the 4th one, is the energetic pathway, which can be anything that has to do with attuning the body. So it could be physical workouts, it could be meditation, breathing exercises, physical yoga, things like that. So knowledge and wisdom, selfless service, devotion, and energy. To me, that's how, when I look at success, is how am I advancing myself in those ways, and how much are those being incorporated in my life? Mm-hmm. And that's ultimately it. And it will manifest in different ways. So that's at a high level how I look at success. But then on a more micro level, there are different versions of it. So if I'm working on a book, for example, then success would be transmitting the information in the clearest way possible and the most accurate way possible, for example, to do the most good to the reader. That would be, so each event or each micro event in my life, I'll have to evaluate that way.
Nice. Do you feel like success has changed dramatically from what you thought after, you were in college to now and everything that you know?
Totally. Yes. Success before was get into a good college, make it onto the tennis team and win lots of tennis matches, make it to an investment bank. These were how I looked at success. And I don't want to fully demean those things, because I think there is definitely a place for material success. And maybe even with this attitude, I would still try those things again. I don't know. But the backdrop would be very different. So it would be like, I want to do this thing, have this success, because it's going to lead to something else that is important spiritually, for example. So it's just a different context that I would look at all those things now.
Nice.
And I should add, Alex, quickly, because this is an important topic in spirituality that I think is often misunderstood. The topic of money, like that can be considered anti-spiritual sometimes, but you could also look at it from a very spiritual lens of, if the intent is to make money so that you can do good things for yourself, and so therefore you can help others more and be more charitable, however that means, then money can be a very spiritually beneficial thing. So I just wanted to make that point.
And on that point, I have something else to say.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. I feel like when it comes to money, some people see this as like a bad thing, like, like, no, that's bad, or like evil, or egocentric, or whatever it is when it comes to like, I want money. But it's definitely not a bad thing. And I feel Laura Powers said once that Tesla mentioned to her that, we always have this little mentality of saying, I want a piece of the pie too. But what he said is like, why would you want just a piece of that pie if there's millions of pies? If you can have not just one slice, but like 3 pies, 4 pies, 8 pies if you want. So I think, definitely abundance is something that it's so infinite. And when it comes to money, we should see money, especially when we are talking about spirituality and all that. It's definitely not a bad thing, and it's a way to serve others, to accomplish so many things in our journey. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. To me, the intent behind anything, whether it's money or anything in life, that's the key, because there is a flip side to it. There can be the greed aspect, and if the only reason to accumulate money is because for power and greed, and that's the only motivation behind it, that's a very different story. So for me, it's always about like how I'm orienting my compass for my overall values, and anything worldly will fit into that, with like the overall intention of trying to evolve myself and others.
Nice. I like that very much. I was going to ask you earlier. So I know a lot of the people now, they don't have a knowledge of like the stories of their great grandparents, their parents, even. How important is like storytelling within your life, like knowing about your grandparents or family members? How important it is for you, and how important do you think storytelling is in humanity itself?
I'll answer the question in two ways.
Yeah.
One is related to the familial aspect and ancestry, and the other is more like the mechanism of storytelling. So I'll start with the familial part.
Mhm.
It's something that I don't feel like I understand very well, because I know that our genetics, of course, influence this vehicle that we're in. But I also wonder from the perspective of consciousness, like, is there residue from our ancestors? And there's a notion of epigenetics, which is still not totally well understood, but it seems like there is, at least from my studies, there's some consensus that basically if a family member experienced a trauma, that trauma can be passed down genetically. So there's something about our experience of our ancestors that can affect us. And we might be carrying trauma and other things, or maybe even things that we like, or who knows what, from our ancestors. So that seems important. And then I wonder if there's something also metaphysically. Are we somehow entangled with our ancestors in some way? Are we trying to clear trauma, not only for ourselves, but also for our ancestors and also for the broader collective? I don't know what that hierarchy is, or if there is one. So my answer would be that I'm not really sure, but I have a feeling that there's some significance to it that is just beyond what I know right now. And then on the topic of storytelling as a delivery mechanism, it's my mind is very like logical and linear, and that's the way that I'm probably naturally that way, but especially like working in investment banking. And then when I was advising companies, the tech companies, the way that we would go about our presentations, it was a lot like what management consultants do. So it's this structured narrative. And also a lot of my client work dealt with the law. So I was reading legal briefs and actually working with attorneys on like constructing cases. So I have this very logical, everything's a case to me. That's one way of learning, but that's not how everyone does it.
Right. Yeah.
Storytelling can be a different way to deliver things that can be really effective. And I think in many cases it can be more effective because there's you can grab onto a story and you might remember the story and then remember the implications of it. And then there might be things that you can transmit in a story that are sort of intangible, like parables and things like that, that you end up getting the lesson better than if you just hear facts.
For sure. Yeah, no, it is true. We all learn different. We all understand life in different ways. And I think what you just said, it actually, it kind of makes like sense. Some people might say storytelling really doesn't help me. I don't understand. Bring me the facts. And so some people understand life or teachings in those ways too. So I guess those 2 points are so valid.
Yeah.
That is awesome. So what are you doing now? Are you writing a book? Are you finishing writing the book?
Well, my most recent book called An End to Upside Down Liberty, that came out a few months ago. So that was such a big project for me. But I'm always researching, and I like each time I've written a book, and even when I did the podcast, I didn't know that was going to happen until way later in the process. So I end up researching, and then it's tended to congeal into an argument that I feel like I can put into a book. So right now I'm not writing anything, but I'm researching a lot because I have a lot of curiosity, and I really don't know where it's going to lead. I mean, this is so counter to how I used to live. I used to love to plan everything 40 steps ahead. And then I just was like, oh, I'm going to leave my job, but I don't know what I'm doing. And here we are, like 2 years later. I've written 2 more books, and I've meditated a lot because previously that wasn't something I could really do. And I went on 2 meditation retreats that were both almost a week long, right before the lockdown started and right as I was transitioning out of my firm. So I've been meditating a lot and researching, and I guess we'll see where it goes.
That is awesome. Do you think life it's a learning process?
It feels that way for sure. It doesn't feel like there's an end to it.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that the learning can sometimes be incremental, where you don't notice it on a week-to-week basis. But if you look back at yourself, the way you were thinking a year or two ago or three, I see the big changes, or the way I handled situations a few years ago versus now. It's a continual process. And I know there's going to be more because there's so many things from a knowledge level that I want to learn that I feel like I don't know. And in like basically in every area of life, I just feel like there's so much that I still need to learn. And then personally, I know there's a lot of growth that can happen.
Yeah, for sure. And going back to the mentors, what was the best thing your mentors, any mentor, have told you that you're like, that you carried that with you?
I would say the principle of looking at the ego. And when I say ego, I'm referring to the sense that my identity is Mark, this body-mind complex, that is who I am, versus this idea of being a consciousness, first and foremost, that's inhabiting the body. And with regard to the ego, there can be a sense that the ego is the one that is doing everything. And then you take ownership over the things that you do really well, but also you take ownership of flaws and failures. And on both sides, it can be really problematic, because then it's arrogant to think that you are the sole contributor to all of these things when there's so many other cosmic factors. So that's an important reminder, because anything I do, I don't mean to imply that we should just be passive and that things are going to happen without effort, but there's this acknowledgement of something that's working through you as you act, that there's an intelligence that's guiding the process. And then that helps with attachments. So not being attached to things that I really want or things that I fear. So desires and aversions, those are the terms that people typically use. And the way I think about it, and I'm thinking about one mentor in particular, is around the idea that we can have desires and fears. I mean, most of our life is run by a desire and a fear, and fear is really the opposite of desire. It's the desire for something not to happen. So it's really all about the things you desire, but that desires are natural, and for those things not to be suppressed. And the nuance here is if we get attached to the outcome of what we desire or fear, that's where it becomes problematic. Because if you become attached to it, then it is this form of arrogance of, wait, I'm Mark and I know this is supposed to happen because I know the cosmic plan or whatever. It really doesn't make any sense to have an attachment to something, but that doesn't preclude having a desire of saying, I want this, or I'm afraid of this, accepting that. The problem is being bound to the attachments. And so I mentioned that I just talked for, 2 or 3 minutes. That principle is so profound. And it's one that I work on every single day, probably always will work on, because as a human being, our instincts push us away from that. But it's really the core, I think, of living a much more peaceful life is acknowledging our desires and fears, allowing them to occur, listening to them, but not being attached to them.
Yeah, for sure. I think Deepak Chopra calls it being in the gap.
It's good.
Yeah, and you're right. Like, it's something that you work every day. Once you are kind of like aware of all that, I think awareness helps us being in that little gap where we're not attached to the outcome of anything that is happening within our lives. Do you feel like trusting what's happening in your life helps you navigate it better?
Trust is a great word for it. That's what it comes down to. And it requires a leap of faith to have that trust. To me, I've spent so much time researching this that it's actually more rational to have that trust, because I think it is built into the nature of reality itself, that there is an intelligence guiding things, and there are things like natural law that are at work. And we have to, no matter what we think we're contributing to that, we have to tame down the ego and remember that stuff's happening beyond our control.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the other thing I would add is that my research has led me to this worldview of that we're all interconnected as part of a universal consciousness. The analogy I always like to give is from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher, who says that we're whirlpools within a stream of consciousness, where the water is analogous to consciousness. So we're all interconnected, but we feel like we're individual whirlpools. What my research has led me to believe is that the nature of this infinite stream of water of consciousness is made of something very benevolent. Many people describe it as unconditional love, like when they have a near-death experience or in a spiritually transformative experience through psychedelics or meditation. To me, these are all different ways of effectively tapping into the outside of your whirlpool, tapping into the nature of the full stream. And there's a consistent message that comes back, which is that all reality is interconnected consciousness made of unconditional love. And that everything that happens to us, even if it feels like it's traumatic and leads to an unpleasant sensation, or if it leads to a pleasant one, it's for our evolution in some way. So it might seem like it's bad, but on a higher level, it's actually good in some way. And that understanding helps with trust as well, because even when something happens that's very jarring, my instinct, because of the way I used to think, and also just because I'm a human being biologically, no, I don't want that to happen. And then I pull back and say, okay, I don't want that to happen, but if it did happen, maybe there's a purpose for it that I don't understand, etc.
Yeah, for sure. I think in my previous interviews, I have asked my guest if, going to that specific traumatic experience changed their life. Sometimes whether it's a physical illness or accident or something like that, that changed people. But sometimes you don't have to go through all that to actually have that change.
Yeah, the way I think about it, and this is a theme that's come up a lot in my research, is that the universe gives us nudges for us to shift our direction. And sometimes if we don't listen to those nudges, then we get hit in the head, and it can manifest differently. And that's what was happening to me. And if I hadn't woken up, so to speak, I'm sure there would have been more kicks in the stomach that would have forced me to evaluate things. So trauma it's good and bad depending on the lens from which we see it. But I tend to look at it as something that is helpful to our evolution, ultimately, as painful as it can be for all of us.
Yeah, I think just the perspective of how we see our lives, as opposed to like even, fall into like depression for years, or like asking yourself, like, why me? Or asking whoever you believe in, like, why are you punishing me with this or that, or accidents, illness, or that. I think once we change the perspective from where we are and acknowledge, like, okay, I lost my leg, or I lost a parent, or this had happened to me, or I lost my job, or whatever it is. I feel like perspective, as opposed to see it in that with that negative lens, see it as the opportunity for you to trust yourself and say, like, okay, where do I need to go from here?
Yeah. And also the notion of karma is related to all of this. Of, when something happens, if we are in an intelligent universe, which I think we are, then nothing is actually random. It might appear to be random to us, but that's only because we can only see it from a limited lens. And if we zoomed out, we'd see it's not random. And this notion of karma comes up all the time. And we see, for example, like in the near-death experience, when people, let's say they're in cardiac arrest, their heart stops beating, they're clinically dead, and yet they have an elaborate experience, which often includes a life review. They relive the events of their life. They become the people that they impacted. They feel the pain or the joy that they brought to that person. And then they come back in their body, and then typically their life changes. So this for them is like a spiritual awakening for sure. But it's not far from the notion of karma, because they come back and say, we're here to learn, and we get to have this life review to see how we acted. And there's a process of reincarnation to be able to then overcome the things that didn't go as well in this lifetime, for example. So all this is to say that being a victim doesn't make sense in the same way, because at some level you're never a victim. You are, everything that is happening to you is because of you, whether you remember that or not. So maybe something you did in a past life, for example, or for some other cosmic reason I can't even think of, is happening. And it's not like you, it's a much more empowering position, is the way I'd put it. Because then you, even if you could perceive yourself as the victim and create that storyline, it's just an opportunity for you to overcome it. So that whatever victimhood you might have temporarily, you can flip that and say, no, there's a way for me to turn this into a positive and evolve.
Yeah, I think that's like super important, especially when people that, you know, have gone through like such a hardships and bad upbringings, and saying like, oh, but you didn't go through what I went through. And, you know, it's not to minimize the suffering of anyone at all, but I think what doesn't kill you definitely makes you stronger. And just to see that perspective, and it goes for everything, whether you're looking for a better job and you hate your job, or you're in a bad marriage, or whatever it is that you feel like, you know, life is against you. I feel like once we change that perspective and the change of mind, and I'm not saying it's easier, because I'm sure for someone that's going through a, you know, horrible situation might be like listening to me like, well, you didn't lose your 2 legs just right now, you know. Obviously I wouldn't know what it's like to be in that way, but I think to empower anyone that's going through those horrific traumas in life, or little traumas, because, you know, they're not measured by the damage, but how they're measured of how we feel about them. Just that, having the perspective, I think it could change our lives dramatically.
You reminded me of one of my favorite spiritual stories that has stuck with me, from one of my favorite teachers named David Hawkins, who passed away several years ago, but he was a modern psychiatrist, a very successful psychiatrist, who then had massive spiritual awakenings. So it's kind of interesting because he has a mystical perspective, but also a Western psychological and psychiatric perspective. He was talking about suffering because it is a very real thing. And I'm glad you mentioned this, because one could interpret our conversation or misinterpret it by saying, well, yeah, like people suffering doesn't matter because, like, who cares? They're evolving and let them suffer. So David Hawkins was referencing one of the great spiritual teachers, Ramana Maharshi, who used to say things like, the world that we see doesn't exist, which at a very, very high level, a very enlightened level, is completely true.
Right.
But what Hawkins would say is that not everyone's operating at that level. And people who are not operating at that level and have suffering, the suffering to them is very, very real. And what Hawkins said, this was like a pivotal shift for me when he said this. He said it's a spiritual error to ignore the suffering of other people, because even though the suffering might be irrational in some ways because of the lack of understanding, to them it is very real. So actually what happened to David Hawkins is he left Western society for several years to basically meditate and reach crazy states of enlightenment and bliss outs and all this stuff. And what he says is that he decided to come back to the world and write books and do teachings because of the suffering of mankind, and felt that there was an obligation and a duty to help with that, even though to him, he had transcended those sorts of attachments in his own life. He felt that it was wrong to ignore the suffering of other people.
Yeah, for sure. Something, you know, that it reminded me is kind of like just any fears. You know, sometimes we look at people or hear stories of like, oh my God, they're so exaggerated about having a fear with spiders. It comes down to the same principle. Like, you have no idea how real that emotion and that fear is for some people. You might be like, it's just a spider, as simple as that. But for the people that are actually having the fear and encountering a spider,
yeah,
like mind-blowing of how much they're suffering through just that experience. So yeah, it's something to really think about as we go through life and we encounter others that are going through different situations that we have never been.
Yeah. And the term that's typically used is compassion or empathy.
Right.
It's an important principle to hold, because a lot of this is paradoxical.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing is true, and then the other thing seems to contradict it, but they're true at the same time. So there is no suffering, but there is suffering. So we can't just because there isn't any suffering, we can't ignore the fact that there is suffering in some cases, and we have to live life accordingly.
Yeah, for sure. That's something really to kind of like hold on to and live our lives through that little lens of like, we need to be compassionate towards others, especially in these times nowadays that we call each other, we're sensitive to certain things. And so just think about it again and know that the suffering from others might not be the same as yours, or you don't think the same as others, but things are definitely real.
Yes.
For sure. Thank you, Mark. These conversations has been amazing. Thank you for being here today. If people want to know more about you, where can they find you?
First of all, Alex, thank you again for inviting me on your show. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed talking to you. You asked great questions, and I hope the conversation is helpful to people.
Thank you.
In terms of ways to find me, my website is the best way. It's my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. And my 3 books so far, they're called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And that's about basically the science behind all of this, ranging from quantum physics to near-death experiences and children with past life memories, basically proving all the philosophical things we're talking about. The second book, An End to Upside Down Living, that's on the spiritual awakening path, including my own, but a lot of the spiritual teachers that I've followed and what I learned from that. And the third book is called An End to Upside Down Liberty, which is about theoretical ways of structuring society politically and economically, if you believe in a lot of these spiritual principles. And those are all available on Amazon, in hard copies, also Kindle and Audible for all 3. And my podcast is called Where Is My Mind? And that's available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, all the major podcast players. And that's clips of my conversations with scientists and experiencers of many of these topics.
Yes. For everyone out there listening, his podcast is amazing. Just let me tell you that. I'm a big fan. And his books are also really cool. I get very, into the facts and science, and I love to prove people that there's actually scientific proof for some of the things that I talk about, that other people talks about. And I think it's just really cool just to see all the science behind what it's going on with a lot of things. So his 3 books are amazing. His podcast, please go check it out. I will put all his information on the show notes for everyone to, if you guys want to get in contact with Mark, say hi, or know more about his books, please do that. And if you need to know anything else and more about my podcast, please go to alexbalgood.com. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube too. And also don't forget my book, it's out. It's called Parents Are Greatest Teachers. You can find it on Amazon and Barnes Nobles too. And so grab a copy, read it, write me a review. And if you want to talk about our stories, please send me a DM and let's share our stories. Thank you, Mark, for being here today.
Thanks again.
Have a blessed day. Thank you.